When my son died, they told me it was natural. A brain aneurysm, sudden, unpredictable. One of those tragic events no one can foresee. That's what the doctors said. That's what the official report stated. And for a brief moment, standing in that quiet hospital corridor, with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I tried to accept it. I tried to believe that the universe had simply taken everything from me in one cruel, irreversible instant. But grief has a way of sharpening certain instincts, especially when you've spent most of your life learning how to read what isn't being said. Michael was 41, healthy, disciplined, the kind of man who woke up at 5:30 every morning to work out in his basement gym before the rest of the world even stirred. He didn't drink excessively, didn't smoke, didn't cut corners when it came to his health. He planned things, measured things, controlled what he could. That's who he was. That's the son I raised. So when they told me his brain had simply failed, I nodded. I thanked them. I signed the papers. And somewhere beneath the shock, something didn't sit right. The memorial service was held 4 days later at a small chapel overlooking the Bow River. It was the kind of place people chose for its peaceful view, as if scenery could soften the weight of loss. The river moved slowly beneath the gray winter sky, indifferent to the grief gathered above it. I stood near the back, listening to voices blur into one another, condolences, soft apologies, carefully rehearsed sympathy. People spoke about Michael the way people always do at funerals, highlighting the best parts, polishing memories into something almost too perfect to feel real. They talked about his kindness, his intelligence, his work ethic. They didn't talk about the fact that he had called me 11 days before he died, his voice tight with something I hadn't been able to name at the time. At the front of the chapel stood Christine, my daughter-in-law, my son's widow. She wore black, of course, elegant, understated, the kind of dress that suggested grief without surrendering to it. A string of pearls rested at her collarbone. Her makeup was flawless, untouched by the tears she dabbed delicately at the corners of her eyes. She moved through the room with a quiet grace, accepting condolences, offering small, composed smiles, touching hands at just the right moment. To anyone watching, she was the picture of a grieving wife. But I had spent 32 years in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the last 20 in forensic investigation. I had learned long ago that grief, like everything else, has patterns. And sometimes it has performances. I saw the moment that shifted everything. A man approached her mid-30s, well-dressed, the kind of suit that fit just a little too well for a funeral. He didn't look like family. He didn't move like someone burdened by loss. They spoke briefly, too quietly for me to hear, but not too quietly to notice. He touched her elbow. A small gesture, intimate but subtle enough to pass unnoticed by most. Christine smiled. Not the smile she'd been giving everyone else. This one was different, familiar, controlled, but real in a way grief isn't. The man left through a side door without speaking to anyone else, and something cold settled in my chest. Christine noticed me watching. She approached, taking my hands in hers, her grip warm, steady, practiced. "Dad," she said softly, "why don't you stay at the house tonight? I can't bear the thought of you driving all the way back to Victoria alone." I had never liked her calling me that. Not really. I tolerated it because Michael loved her, because it made things easier. "I'll be fine," I told her. Booked a hotel downtown. Her fingers tightened slightly around mine. "You shouldn't be alone right now," she insisted. "We're family." The word felt misplaced, hollow, but I nodded anyway. Because grief makes you agreeable. It makes you quiet. It makes you accept things you might otherwise question. Or at least, that's what she thought. That night, in the silence of the hotel room, I sat by the window and watched the city lights blur through tears I didn't bother to wipe away. My mind replayed the last conversation I'd had with my son. It had been late, almost midnight. "Dad," he had said, "I need to ask you something." There was something in his voice. Not panic. Not exactly. But something close. "If anything ever happened to me, would you promise to look after things? Make sure everything was handled right?" I had laughed, lightly, dismissing it. "You're 41, Michael. Nothing's going to happen to you. Just promise me." And I had. I promised. Now he was gone. And I didn't know what I had promised to protect. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, pulling me out of the memory. A message from a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Fontaine, this is Daniel Okonkwo. I was Michael's business partner. I need to speak with you urgently. Please don't tell Christine. I think she knows I have it." I stared at the screen, my pulse slowing into something colder, sharper. "Knows I have what?" A second message appeared almost immediately. "A USB drive. Michael hid it in his workshop. You need to see what's on it." The room seemed to shrink around me. In that moment, grief shifted. Not gone, not diminished, but focused. Because whatever had taken my son, whatever had made him call me in the middle of the night, asking for a promise he never explained, it wasn't over. And for the first time since they told me his death was natural, I realized something with absolute clarity. Michael had been afraid, and now, so was I. I met Daniel the next morning in a quiet coffee shop tucked away in Kensington, far enough from downtown that we wouldn't risk running into anyone who knew Christine. He had chosen the place deliberately, I could tell that much, from the way he kept glancing at the door, as if expecting someone to walk in and expose us both. When I arrived, he was already seated in the corner, a laptop in front of him, and a paper cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He stood quickly when he saw me, extending his hand with a grip that was firm but unsteady. "Mr. Fontaine, thank you for coming." "Call me Robert," I said, though he only nodded, too distracted to repeat it. Up close, I could see the strain on his face. His eyes were tired, his movements restless, fingers tapping against the table in a rhythm that betrayed his nerves. This wasn't just grief. This was fear. "You said you found something," I prompted, lowering myself into the chair across from him. Daniel glanced around once more before reaching into his jacket pocket. From it, he pulled a small black USB drive and placed it gently on the table between us, as if it were something fragile or dangerous. "I found this in Michael's workshop," he said quietly, "hidden inside a hollowed-out book. To Kill a Mockingbird. He told me once it was his favorite." I stared at the device, no larger than my thumb, and felt something tighten in my chest. "What's on it?" I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Everything." The word hung there, heavy and undefined. He turned the laptop toward me and inserted the drive. The screen flickered briefly, then a list of folders appeared, dozens of them, each labeled with dates, categories, names. Organized, precise. Exactly the way Michael had always done things. My hands began to tremble before I even opened the first file. Daniel clicked. Bank statements filled the screen. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Routine transactions, business expenses, transfers between accounts. But as he scrolled, patterns emerged. Repeating withdrawals. Payments to entities I didn't recognize. Amounts that, taken individually, might have gone unnoticed, but together told a different story. "Look at the totals," Daniel said softly. I did. Over $800,000. "Gone. Christine," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's been moving the money for over a year." The room felt suddenly smaller. "Where?" I asked. He clicked another file. An account name appeared. Bradley Weston. The name meant nothing to me yet. Daniel opened a photograph. And there he was. The man from the funeral. The one with the perfectly fitted suit. The one who had touched Christine's elbow like it was the most natural thing in the world. "They've been seeing each other for almost 4 years, Daniel said. "Michael found out 8 months ago." The next series of files made my stomach turn. Photographs. Dozens of them. Christine and Bradley at restaurants, leaning across candlelit tables, walking side by side along unfamiliar beaches, entering hotel lobbies together, unaware or unconcerned that someone might be watching. Each image was time-stamped, each one aligned with dates Michael had been out of town for work. Trusting her, waiting to come home. I felt something inside me begin to fracture, not loudly, not violently, but in a slow, controlled way that made it worse. This wasn't just betrayal. It was calculation, repetition, a life lived in parallel, hidden in plain sight. But Daniel wasn't finished. "There's more," he said, his hand hesitating over the trackpad for just a second before opening another folder. A document appeared. A letter, dated 2 weeks before Michael died. I recognized his writing immediately, the structure, the clarity, the careful way he chose his words. "Dad," it began. I didn't realize I'd stopped breathing until Daniel gently said my name. Everything after that felt distant, like I was reading from underwater. Michael had known, not just about the affair, about the money, about everything. He had hired a private investigator, collected evidence, planned to file for divorce after the holidays. And then something changed. "She knows I know," he had written. The words blurred as my vision tightened. He described how Christine had started watching him, asking questions about his routines, his health, his supplements, how she had pushed him to increase his life insurance policy, how she had suggested adding coverage for accidental death. I read that part twice, then 3 times. The letter ended with a line that settled into my chest like ice. "If something happens to me, don't accept it as natural." I closed my eyes. For a moment, the noise of the cafe disappeared completely. All I could see was my son, disciplined, careful, intelligent, sitting somewhere alone, writing those words with the full understanding that he might not live long enough to explain them. He had been afraid, and he had prepared. He had left a trail. For me. When I opened my eyes again, the grief was still there, but it had changed. It had hardened. Because the man I had raised hadn't died without knowing why. And now, neither would I. Once the initial shock settled into something colder and more controlled, I forced myself to look again, this time not as a grieving father, but as an investigator. Emotion had its place, but clarity required distance. And what unfolded on that screen was not chaos. It was structure, a pattern, a deliberate system built over time. Daniel navigated through the folders while I watched, each click revealing another layer of deception that had been hidden beneath the surface of my son's marriage. The first set of files focused on financial records, months of bank statements, spreadsheets Michael had compiled himself, annotations in the margins explaining irregularities he had clearly spent weeks trying to understand. At first glance, the transactions were subtle. Small transfers labeled as business expenses, payments to consulting vendors, donations to organizations that sounded legitimate enough to avoid suspicion. But when you followed the trail, when you stepped back and looked at the cumulative flow of money, the illusion collapsed. It wasn't random. It was systematic. Over 18 months, more than $800,000 had been siphoned out of their joint accounts. Not withdrawn in large, obvious chunks, but moved in increments just small enough to blend into the background of a successful household with steady income. It was the kind of financial bleed designed to go unnoticed unless someone was specifically looking for it. Michael had been looking. Daniel opened a spreadsheet labeled simply, "Tracking." Every transaction was listed, every transfer categorized, dates, amounts, account numbers, all aligned with a precision that reflected Michael's engineering mind. And at the center of it all was a single destination, Bradley Weston. The name appeared again and again, tied to a receiving account that had no legitimate connection to Michael's business or personal finances. Michael didn't recognize it at first, Daniel said quietly, but once he started digging, everything led back to him. I nodded, my eyes fixed on the screen. "Show me." He clicked into another folder. Photographs appeared. Not surveillance footage in the traditional sense, no grainy images, no distant angles. These were clear, intentional, taken close enough to remove any doubt. Christine and Bradley, together. In restaurants where the lighting was warm and intimate. At outdoor cafes, leaning toward each other across small tables. Walking along a beach somewhere tropical, their hands intertwined in a way that spoke of familiarity, not secrecy. One image stopped me. They were laughing, not posing, not aware of the camera, just laughing. The kind of unguarded moment people share when they believe they are safe. The timestamp was from a Thursday afternoon. I knew exactly where Michael had been that day. He had called me that evening, as he always did, talking about a project deadline and asking how I was doing. There had been nothing in his voice to suggest he suspected anything at that point. While he was speaking to me, she had been with him. I swallowed, forcing my focus back to the evidence. "How long?" I asked. Daniel hesitated. "Almost 4 years." 4 years? The number echoed in my mind, stretching backward across birthdays, holidays, family dinners. Every shared moment now carried a second version, one I had never seen. "She met him at the gym," Daniel continued. "He was her personal trainer. That's how it started." Of course, it was. Convenient. Accessible. A routine that required no explanation. I leaned back slightly, exhaling through my nose. And the money? I asked. Daniel clicked again. Email correspondence filled the screenshot messages, carefully worded, often disguised as something else. References to sessions, packages, transfers, language that could pass as legitimate if you didn't know what you were looking at. But now, with the context in place, it was obvious. Payments disguised as training fees. Large ones. And increasing over time. It wasn't just the affair, Daniel said. She was funding him, supporting his lifestyle. Another document appeared, a breakdown Michael had compiled, connecting specific transfers to known purchases. Luxury items, travel bookings, lease payments on a vehicle registered under Bradley's name. All of it traced back to money that belonged to Michael, to the life he had built, to the trust he had placed in his wife. I felt something shift inside me, not an explosion of anger, but a tightening, a controlled, deliberate hardening of resolve. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was sustained, calculated. Christine hadn't just betrayed my son emotionally. She had been dismantling his life piece by piece, using the very structure of their marriage as cover. And the most disturbing part wasn't just how long it had gone on. It was how easily it had been hidden. I looked again at the photographs, at the timestamps, at the accounts, at the careful layering of lies. Michael had been living in a reality that was slowly being rewritten without his knowledge. Until, eventually, he noticed. Until he started asking questions. Until he began pulling at threads that led to something far deeper than infidelity. I turned to Daniel. And he documented all of this? Daniel nodded. Everything. He said if anything ever happened, someone needed to know. I looked back at the screen, at the evidence my son had left behind. He hadn't just discovered the truth. He had preserved it. Because somewhere along the way, he had realized something I was only beginning to understand now. This wasn't just betrayal. It was preparation for something worse. And whatever that was, it had already begun. Daniel hesitated before opening the next file, as if he understood perhaps better than I did, that whatever came next would not simply add information. It would change everything. He clicked once, then turned the laptop toward me without saying a word. The document was simple. No attachments, no formatting, just a plain text file. A letter, dated 2 weeks before Michael died. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to read it. My eyes stayed fixed on the first line, as if crossing that threshold would make everything irreversible. Because instinct told me this wasn't just a message, it was a confession of fear, a final attempt to be heard. "Take your time," Daniel said quietly. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could. Then I started reading. Even that single word carried weight. Not formal, not distant, just Dad. The way he had always addressed me when something mattered. "If you're reading this, something has happened to me, and I need you to know the truth." My throat tightened. There was no hesitation in his writing, no uncertainty. He wasn't speculating, he was preparing. I discovered Christine's affair 8 months ago. I didn't confront her immediately. I wanted to be sure, to understand how deep it went, so I hired a private investigator. I documented everything. I paused there, picturing him methodical, controlled, trying to process a betrayal that would have shattered most people, not reacting impulsively, not lashing out, just gathering facts. That was Michael, always thinking ahead. The evidence is clear. She's been seeing him for years. His name is Bradley Weston, her trainer. I have photos, financial records, messages. I was planning to file for divorce after the holidays. I wanted to do it cleanly, protect what I could, and move on. A life reduced to strategy, to containment. But then the tone shifted, subtly at first. Then unmistakably, 3 weeks ago, something changed. I felt my chest tighten again. Christine knows I know. I read that line twice. Then again. I don't know how she found out. Maybe she saw something on my computer. Maybe someone told her. But since then, she's been different. Different. Such a simple word. But I could feel the weight behind it. She's been watching me, asking questions that don't make sense, about my health, my routines, my supplements. She's suddenly very interested in things she never cared about before. My hands began to shake. This wasn't paranoia. This was observation, pattern recognition, the same instincts I had relied on for decades now written in my son's voice. She keeps bringing up life insurance, saying we should be prepared, that anything can happen. Last week, she suggested I increase my coverage, add a rider for accidental death. The room around me seemed to fade. Every word was precise, measured, and filled with something I had never heard from Michael before. Fear. I might be overreacting. I hope I am. But something doesn't feel right. I can't explain it fully. Just a sense that I'm being managed, positioned, managed. The word struck me harder than anything else, because it implied intent, control, design. 2 days ago, I changed the beneficiary on my policy. It's in your name now. She doesn't know. I closed my eyes briefly, the weight of that decision settling over me. He had been preparing, not just for divorce, for something worse. Dad, if something happens to me, if it looks like an accident, or something natural, please don't accept it at face value. My vision blurred. I forced myself to keep reading. Please look deeper. You taught me how to think, how to question things that don't add up. You spent your life finding truth where others didn't look. There it was. The reason this letter existed. Not just to explain, but to assign responsibility. I didn't tell you sooner because I thought I could handle it. I didn't want to worry you, and maybe I was ashamed. That I didn't see it earlier, that I trusted her. The words slowed, became heavier, more personal. I love you. I'm sorry. That was the line that broke me. Not the fear, not the suspicion, but the apology, as if he believed any of this was his fault. I reached the final line. Your son, Michael. Silence filled the space around us. I didn't realize I had stopped breathing until Daniel gently closed the laptop. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to say. The truth had already been written, carefully, deliberately, left behind by a man who understood that he might not survive long enough to explain it in person. I leaned back in my chair, staring at nothing. My son had known. He had seen the betrayal. He had planned his escape. And when that plan was threatened, when the person he trusted most realized she was about to lose everything, he had become afraid for his life. That fear had not been imagined. It had been reasoned, observed, documented, and ignored. By May, I thought back to his call 11 days before he died. If anything ever happened to me. At the time, I had dismissed it, treated it like an abstract concern. Now I understood. It hadn't been abstract. It had been a warning, and I had heard it without listening. I opened my eyes slowly. The grief was still there, but it had changed again. It was no longer just loss. It was something sharper, more focused, because this letter wasn't just a message from my son. It was a directive, a request, a responsibility. He had done everything he could, left evidence, connected the pieces, pointed me toward the truth. Now it was my turn. And this time, I wasn't going to miss what was right in front of me. Not again. I went to the police that same afternoon, carrying everything Michael had left behind as if it were proof enough to bend reality back into something that made sense. The USB drive, the financial records, the photographs, and most importantly, the letter. I had spent decades in law enforcement. I knew how evidence worked, how patterns formed, how cases were built. This wasn't speculation. It was direction. It was motive, behavior, and warning, all aligned too precisely to ignore. They sent me to Detective Sarah Chen. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated at first. Her office was quiet, organized, the kind of space that suggested competence and control. I laid everything out carefully, walking her through it step by step: the affair, the missing money, the timeline, the shift in Michael's behavior, and finally, the letter. When I finished, she leaned back slightly, folding her hands together. "Mr. Fontaine," she said calmly, "I understand why you're concerned." Concerned. The word landed wrong. "My son wrote that he feared for his life," I replied. "He documented financial theft, infidelity, and behavioral changes in his wife. He died 12 days later under what's being called natural causes. That's not just concern, that's cause." She nodded slowly, glancing down at the documents again. The medical examiner conducted a full review, she said. There were no signs of trauma, no external injuries, no indication of foul play. Brain aneurysms can occur suddenly even in individuals with no prior symptoms. I felt something tighten in my chest. My son was healthy, I said, keeping my voice level. He ran marathons. He had a full physical 6 months ago, clean across the board. No family history, no warning signs. That doesn't rule it out, she replied gently. These things can develop without detection. I stared at her. This isn't just about the medical report, I said. This is about context, motive, behavior. He believed he was in danger. She picked up the letter, scanning it again. This document shows that your son suspected something, she said carefully. It also shows marital issues, infidelity, financial misconduct. Those are serious matters. But they don't establish homicide. They establish intent, I said. They establish conflict, she corrected. The distinction felt like a wall being built between us. I leaned forward slightly. If someone wanted to make a death look natural, I said, choosing my words with precision, they wouldn't leave signs of trauma. They would rely on exactly what you're describing, something that appears spontaneous, untraceable. She held my gaze for a moment. And without evidence of how that might have been done, she said, we don't have grounds to reopen the case. There it was. The line. Clean, final, procedural. I sat back slowly, the weight of it settling in. So that's it? I asked. A letter, documented fraud, an affair, behavioral red flags, and we just accept that he died because his body failed him? Her expression softened, but her tone didn't change. We follow evidence, she said. Not suspicion. I let the silence stretch. Because I knew that line. I had said it myself countless times to people who believed something terrible had happened but couldn't prove it. Now I was on the other side of it. And it felt different. It felt incomplete. I gathered the documents one by one, placing them back into the folder with more care than necessary, as if the act itself might preserve their significance. Thank you for your time, I said. She nodded. If new evidence comes forward, she added, we can revisit the case. I stood. New evidence. As if what I had just shown her wasn't already pointing towards something that deserved to be questioned. As if my son's fear wasn't evidence of anything at all. I left the station with the same folder in my hands, but something had changed. Not the facts. Not the truth. Just the understanding. No one was going to do this for me. Not yet. Not without something undeniable. And as I stepped out into the cold afternoon air, one realization settled in with absolute clarity. If I wanted answers, I was going to have to find them myself. I returned to Christine's house that evening with a decision already made. If the truth wasn't going to be handed to me, I would have to take it apart myself, piece by piece, the way I had done for 32 years. The difference this time was that the case wasn't a file. It was my son. And the suspect wasn't a stranger. It was the woman who had stood at the front of a chapel 4 days earlier, accepting condolences with perfect composure. Christine opened the door before I knocked, as if she had been waiting. I'm glad you came back, she said softly, stepping aside to let me in. You shouldn't be alone right now. I gave her a tired smile, one that required no effort to perform. Neither should you. The house felt unchanged, clean, ordered, calm. Michael's presence lingered in the details, the way the furniture was arranged, the books he had chosen, the faint smell of the coffee he used to brew every morning. And yet something about it felt wrong now, like a stage set after the actors had already left. Dinner was already prepared. Roast chicken. Rosemary potatoes. Michael's favorite. Thought we could both use something familiar, Christine said, setting plates on the table. I watched her movements carefully, controlled, efficient, not rushed, not distracted. If she was nervous, she didn't show it. We sat across from each other, the silence filled only by the soft clink of cutlery. It helps to have family close, she said after a moment. We should support each other through this. I nodded. It's what Michael would have wanted. The words tasted like something I had to swallow rather than speak. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, listening. Houses tell you things if you're patient enough. The rhythm of footsteps, the timing of doors, the difference between someone moving naturally and someone being careful not to be heard. At 11:43 p.m., I heard her bedroom door close. At 2:17 a.m., I heard it open again. Soft footsteps down the hallway. A pause, then movement toward the kitchen. Water running, a cabinet opening. Then silence. I didn't move. Not yet. Observation comes first. Action later. The next morning, I became what she expected me to be. Grieving, quiet, distracted. I asked simple questions, made small talk, allowed long silences to exist without filling them. I let her lead conversations, let her explain things I already knew, let her believe I had accepted everything at face value. It wasn't difficult. People see what they expect to see. And Christine expected to see a broken old man who had just lost his only child, not someone who was watching her every move. By the third day, patterns began to emerge. She left the house every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at exactly 2:15 p.m. Grief counseling, she said the first time, visiting a friend, the second, just getting out for a bit, the third. Different explanations. Same timing. That was enough. On Wednesday, I followed her. I waited 5 minutes after she left, then got into my car and kept a comfortable distance, far enough not to be noticed, close enough not to lose her in traffic. She drove with confidence, no hesitation, no signs of someone worried about being followed. That told me more than anything else. She didn't think she needed to be careful. She turned into a residential complex in Mount Royal, a quiet area, well-maintained, the kind of place people chose for privacy. I parked across the street, watched. She entered building 412, without looking back. I waited. Timing matters. After 10 minutes, I crossed the street and positioned myself where I could see through a side window partially obscured by blinds. And there he was, Bradley Weston, the man from the funeral, the man from the photographs. He opened the door before she even knocked. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. She stepped inside, and he pulled her into an embrace that had none of the restraint she had shown in public. No performance, no calculation, just familiarity, comfort. I took out my phone. Photographs, angles, timestamps. Not because I needed proof of the affair anymore, but because documentation turns suspicion into evidence. I stayed for 20 minutes, long enough to establish a pattern, long enough to confirm that whatever they had, it hadn't ended with Michael's death. It had continued, uninterrupted. That night, while Christine slept, I began searching the house. Not recklessly, not destructively, carefully, systematically. Michael's office had been cleared, too clean, no personal files, no notes. Even the computer had been wiped. It was the kind of job someone does when they believe they've covered everything. But no one ever covers everything. Not completely. In the basement, behind the furnace, I found the first mistake. A small plastic bag. Inside it, 2 prescription bottles with their labels removed. That alone was enough to raise suspicion. But one of them still contained residue. I didn't touch it directly. I used a cloth, sealed it again, stored it in a separate container. Evidence is fragile. Not because it breaks, but because it can be dismissed if handled incorrectly. The next day I searched her car. Glove compartment. Under the owner's manual. Receipts. From a pharmacy in Red Deer. Cash purchases. No names. But the dates matched the timeline in Michael's letter. I photographed everything. Stored copies in multiple places. Built redundancy. Because evidence doesn't matter if it disappears. By the end of the week, I had something tangible. Not proof. Not yet. But direction. A pattern of behavior. A chain of actions that didn't align with the story she had presented to the world. And most importantly, a growing certainty. Christine wasn't just hiding something. She was protecting something. And whatever that was, it was worth killing for. I sat in the dark that night, the house silent around me, the weight of what I was uncovering settling in slowly. For the first time since Michael died, I wasn't just reacting. I was building a case against the woman who had called me Dad. And I knew, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, this wasn't over. Not even close. The first real break didn't come from a confession or a witness. It came from something small, something overlooked. A residue. I brought the bottle upstairs that night, placing it on the desk beneath the lamp, turning it slowly between my fingers without ever touching the opening. The label had been removed cleanly, too cleanly. Whoever had done it had taken care to eliminate anything that might identify the contents. But they hadn't emptied it completely. That was the mistake. In my years with the RCMP, I had learned that most people don't get caught because they make obvious errors. They get caught because they assume they've erased everything. Because they believe what remains is too insignificant to matter. It always matters. I held the bottle up to the light. There it was, barely visible, a thin crystalline residue clinging to the inner glass. Colorless, odorless, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But I was. And suddenly, a memory surfaced. Not personnel, professional. A case from years ago, hospital-related. A patient who had died unexpectedly, initially ruled as cardiac failure. No trauma, no external signs. Nothing that raised suspicion until someone asked the right question about what had been administered intravenously. Potassium chloride. I set the bottle down slowly. My mind began to shift into a familiar pattern, not emotional, not reactive, but analytical. Step by step, possibility by possibility. Potassium chloride, in the right concentration, could stop the heart, disrupt electrical signaling, induce cardiac arrest in a way that could be mistaken for natural causes, especially if no one was looking for it. And more importantly, it was difficult to detect. Standard toxicology panels didn't always include potassium analysis unless there was a specific reason. After death, potassium levels naturally rise due to cellular breakdown, which makes distinguishing between natural and induced levels complicated. Convenient. Too convenient. I leaned back in the chair, the pieces beginning to align in a way that made my chest tighten. Michael died in the basement, during his morning workout, alone. Or at least, that's what we had been told. I closed my eyes, reconstructing the timeline. 5:30 a.m. Michael begins his routine. Christine supposedly asleep. No witnesses. No interruption. If someone had been there, if someone had approached him at the right moment when his body was already under strain, when his focus was elsewhere, it wouldn't have taken much. En injection. Quick. Precise. Into the arm. Minimal resistance. Minimal noise. And within minutes, collapse. By the time anyone found him, the event would appear exactly as described. Sudden. Unexplained. Natural. I opened my eyes. Not natural. Engineered. I stood and moved to the window, staring out into the dark, my reflection faintly visible against the glass. Think, I muttered to myself, because theory wasn't enough. I needed support. Corroboration. I went back downstairs and reviewed the receipts I had found in Christine's car. Red Deer Pharmacy. Cash purchases. Dates aligned with the weeks leading up to Michael's death. I zoomed in on one of the photographs. Item description partially visible. Potassium. The rest was cut off. But I didn't need the full word. I already knew. My pulse slowed not from calm, but from clarity. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This was direction. I picked up my phone and called Daniel. I need a favor, I said when he answered. Within hours, he had reached out to a contact at the medical examiner's office. Not officially, just enough to ask the right questions. What did they test for? I asked. Standard panel, he replied. Alcohol, common toxins, narcotics, nothing unusual. Potassium? A pause. No, why would they? Exactly. Why would they? There had been no reason. No visible injury. No sign of injection. No context that suggested anything other than a natural event. Unless you knew where to look. I ended the call and sat in silence. The implications settled in slowly, like something sinking beneath the surface. My son hadn't just been betrayed. He had been studied. His routines observed. His habits used against him. Someone had waited. Planned. Chosen a method that would leave almost nothing behind. And for a moment, I felt something close to doubt. Because this required intent at a level most people never reach. Precision. Patience. A willingness to cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. Then I remembered the letter. She's been watching me. She's asking about my health. She wants me to increase my insurance. The doubt disappeared, replaced by something colder. Acceptance. I went back to the desk and looked at the bottle again. At the residue. at the only physical trace of something that had been designed to disappear, and I understood, with absolute certainty, Michael hadn't died from a brain aneurysm. He had been poisoned, carefully, deliberately, in his own home, by someone who knew exactly how to make it look like nothing at all. I exhaled slowly, the weight of the realization settling into something steady and controlled. This was it. The method. The missing piece. The reason everything else had felt wrong. Now I didn't just have motive. I didn't just have suspicion. I had a path forward. Because the truth, no matter how carefully it's buried, always leaves something behind. And I had just found it. The call came 3 weeks after I sent the samples to the lab. I was sitting alone in the hotel room, the same one I had been using as a place to think, to plan, to stay just far enough away from Christine without raising suspicion. My phone lit up on the table, the number unfamiliar, but something in me already knew. I answered before it could ring a second time. Mr. Fontaine? Yes. This is Dr. Keller from the Toronto Forensic Laboratory. We've completed the analysis you requested. I stood slowly, my grip tightening around the phone. And? I asked. There was a pause. Not hesitation, precision. We found elevated levels of potassium chloride in the preserved tissue samples. Levels inconsistent with post-mortem changes. Additionally, there is microscopic evidence of a puncture consistent with injection near the left arm. For a moment I couldn't speak. The room seemed to fall silent around me, every sound fading into something distant and irrelevant. It was real. Not theory. Not suspicion. Proof. My son was poisoned, I said quietly. Yes, the doctor replied. Based on the evidence, that would be the conclusion. I closed my eyes. Not from grief. From certainty. Everything Michael had feared had happened. Thank you, I said, and ended the call. I didn't sit down. I didn't hesitate. I picked up the folder, every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence I had collected, and drove straight to the police station. This time I didn't ask for a meeting. I demanded one. Detective Chen saw it the moment I placed the lab report in front of her. Her expression changed before she even finished reading. Potassium chloride injection, she said under her breath, flipping to the next page. Confirmed levels. Injection site. She looked up at me, and for the first time there was no distance in her eyes. This is definitive. Yes. Silence filled the room, but it was a different kind now. Not dismissal. Action. She closed the folder, her posture shifting, voice sharpening. Mr. Fontaine, I'm reopening this case as a homicide investigation effective immediately. The words landed with weight. Final. Irreversible. What happens next? I asked. We move fast, she said. We secure warrants, collect corroborating evidence, and build a case strong enough to hold in court. I need you to continue exactly as you have been. Stay with her. Act normal. We can't risk tipping her off. I nodded. How long? A few days, she replied. Maybe a week, but once we move, it will be decisive. I left the station with something I hadn't felt since Michael died. Direction. Not grief. Not confusion. Purpose. 3 days later, everything came together. I was back at the house, sitting across from Christine in the living room. She had poured wine, arranged cheese on a plate, speaking casually about paperwork, about selling the house, about moving forward. Her voice was light, almost relieved. I've been thinking, she said, swirling her glass, maybe somewhere warmer. Michael always talked about traveling. I think I owe it to him to live fully. I watched her carefully. Every word, every movement. She believed she had won, that everything had been buried, that the story was over. My phone buzzed softly in my pocket. A message. Warrant executed. I didn't react, didn't look down, just nodded as if I was listening to her. That sounds like a good plan, I said. Seconds later, her phone rang. She frowned, glancing at the screen before answering. Hello? I watched her face change in real time. Confusion, then tension, then something sharper. What do you mean? She said, her voice rising. They're where? Bradley's place? Why? Silence as she listened. Then? That doesn't make any sense. She stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes flicked toward me. For the first time since I had known her, the mask slipped. Dad, Something's come up, she said quickly, standing. Can we talk later? Of course, I replied calmly. Is everything all right? Yes, she said too quickly. Just paperwork. She moved toward the door, already reaching for her keys. But she didn't make it that far. Headlights swept across the front window. Then another set, and another. Christine froze. A sharp knock echoed through the house. 3 times. Firm. Controlled. Final. She didn't move. Neither did I. The knock came again. Christine Fontaine, a voice called from the other side. Police. Open the door. Her breathing changed faster now, uneven. No, she whispered. No, no, no. I stood slowly, walked past her, opened the door. Detective Chen stood on the porch, flanked by 2 officers. Her expression was calm, focused. Christine Fontaine, she said, stepping forward. You are under arrest for the murder of Michael Fontaine. Time seemed to fracture. Christine stepped back, shaking her head violently. This is a mistake. There's been some kind of misunderstanding. Turn around, one of the officers instructed. She looked at me then, really looked, and in that moment there was no grief, no performance, just raw, unfiltered realization. You, she whispered. I didn't answer. Didn't need to. The handcuffs clicked into place, sharp, echoing, final, as they led her past me, out into the night. The weight of everything settled in. The lies, the betrayal, the fear Michael had carried alone. All of it had led here, to this moment. And as the police car door closed behind her, I felt something shift, not relief, not satisfaction, but something quieter. Truth, finally, uncovered. The trial began in early September, nearly 9 months after Michael's death, 9 months of silence, of careful preparation, of building a case strong enough to withstand scrutiny from every angle. By the time it reached the courtroom, what had once been dismissed as a natural tragedy had transformed into something far more precise. A calculated murder. I sat in the front row every day, directly behind the prosecution, close enough that Christine could see me whenever she turned her head. And she did often. Not with remorse, not even with anger, but with something colder. A kind of disbelief that I had become the reason her world was collapsing. She no longer looked like the woman from the funeral. The composure was still there, but it was strained now. Her expressions were tighter, her movements more controlled, as if she were holding something in place that threatened to break at any moment. Bradley Weston sat at the opposite end of the courtroom, separated from her. He had already accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony. 12 years. Reduced from something far worse. His cooperation had turned him from co-conspirator into the prosecution's most valuable witness. When he took the stand, the room shifted. You could feel it. Because this was no longer about documents or forensic reports. This was about intention. They planned it, the prosecutor said simply, and he was there to explain how. Bradley avoided looking at Christine as he spoke. His voice lacked confidence not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what he was admitting. It started as an idea, he said. She brought it up first. A murmur moved through the courtroom. She said Michael was holding her back, that she deserved more, that if he was gone, everything would be easier. I felt my jaw tighten, not from surprise, from confirmation. We talked about it for months, Bradley continued. Different ways, different options. She wanted something that wouldn't be traced, something that looked natural. The prosecutor stepped closer. And what method did you agree on? Potassium chloride, he said. The words landed exactly as expected. Cold, clinical, final. He described how they had researched it, how it could induce cardiac arrest, how it would blend into natural post-mortem changes, how it could pass through initial examinations without raising suspicion. She practiced, he added quietly, injecting saline into fruit, oranges, just to get comfortable with it. I closed my eyes briefly, not because I hadn't known, but because hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way evidence never could. When did the plan move forward? The prosecutor asked. The morning it happened, Bradley said. She knew his routine, knew he'd be alone in the basement. She told me she'd take care of it. And after? She called me later that day, said it was done. Silence filled the room. Heavy, unavoidable. Christine's defense attempted to dismantle his testimony, painting him as the manipulator, the architect, the one who had pressured her into everything, but the evidence didn't support it. The pharmacy footage showed her making the purchase. The emails came from her devices. The financial records traced back to her accounts. And then there was Michael's letter. When the prosecutor read it aloud, the courtroom changed again. Not in volume, in feeling. Each word carried the weight of a man who had known what was coming and had tried, in the only way he could, to leave something behind. By the time it ended, even the jury was no longer just listening. They were understanding, deliberating. The verdict came after 6 hours. 6 hours to process months of planning, years of betrayal, and a death that had been designed to look like nothing at all. We all stood as the jury filed in. Christine didn't look at me this time. She stared straight ahead. On the charge of first-degree murder, the room held its breath. We find the defendant guilty. A sharp intake of air. Then, on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. Christine's composure finally broke. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. Her shoulders collapsed inward, as if something inside her had finally given way. Bradley sat motionless, his fate already sealed by his own testimony. The sentencing came 3 months later. Life imprisonment. No parole for 25 years. The judge's words were measured, but unyielding. You planned the death of a man who trusted you completely. You executed that plan with precision and without hesitation. This court finds no evidence of remorse, only regret at being caught. Christine said nothing. Not then, not at any point after. As she was led away, I felt something settle inside me. Not closure. There is no closure in losing a child, but something else. Something quieter. The truth had been seen, acknowledged, judged, and for the first time since Michael died, it had been answered. After the trial ended, the silence returned, but it was no longer the same kind. Before, it had been empty, directionless, a space filled only with grief and unanswered questions. Now, it carried something else beneath it. Not peace, not entirely, but purpose. Something that gave shape to the loss, instead of letting it consume everything around it. Michael was gone. That truth didn't change. It didn't soften. It didn't become easier with time. But what had changed was what remained. Because my son hadn't just left behind memories. He had left behind evidence. A trail. A voice that refused to disappear. And I realized, slowly at first, that what I had done for him could be done for others. The idea of the foundation came quietly, not as a grand decision, not as something planned in advance, but as a continuation of what had already begun. Families reached out after the case became public. People who had lost someone under circumstances that didn't feel right, but had been told the same thing I had. There's no evidence. It was natural. There's nothing more we can do. I knew those words. I had heard them from both sides. And I knew how easily truth could be missed if no one was willing to look deeper. So I built something. Not large. Not at first. Just a framework. A place where people could bring their doubts, their documents, their unanswered questions, and have them taken seriously. The Michael Fontaine Foundation. Named not for how he died, but for what he had the courage to leave behind. Daniel helped run the operations from Calgary. He understood the work, understood the weight of it. Together, we reviewed cases, guided families through the process of documenting evidence properly, connected them with independent labs, legal resources, investigators who would actually listen. In 2 years, we helped 11 families. 8 cases were reopened. 5 led to arrests. Numbers don't usually matter to me, but those did, because behind each one was someone like Michael, someone who had been overlooked, misunderstood, or dismissed too quickly. At home in Victoria, I kept Michael's room exactly the way he had left it. The hockey posters on the wall. The telescope we bought together when he was 12. When he used to stay up late trying to map constellations he barely understood but refused to give up on. Sometimes, I sit there, not out of habit, out of connection. I talk to him, not because I expect an answer, but because some conversations don't end just because one person is gone. I tell him about the foundation, about the people we've helped, about the cases that reminded me of him, of his clarity, his courage, his decision to document the truth even when it frightened him. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and the world feels still, I allow myself to believe that he knows, that he understands, that what he did mattered, that his voice didn't disappear. It changed direction, carried forward by someone who had promised to listen. Tonight, I sit on the back deck, watching the sun fall behind the horizon, the sky stretching into shades of gold and violet. This is where he proposed to Christine. A different life, a different future, one that never came. The grief is still there. It always will be. A space that nothing fills. But alongside it, there is something else now. Something steady. Earned. Justice. Not perfect. Not complete. But real. I look out at the fading light and speak quietly, not out of habit, but because the words still matter. I kept my promise. The wind moves gently across the water. The world continues, unchanged and indifferent. But I remain. Still here. Still working. Still following the path my son left behind. And as long as I have the strength to do it, I will make sure of one thing, that what happened to him never disappears into silence again.